Hello everyone, welcome back to Dexter's Tech Lab. So this video is going to be another Quantel history lesson. We're going to look at a particular piece of Quantel hardware from the 90s and into the 2000s a little bit. Basically this was used on most of the V-Series machines that Quantel produced. And it was quite an important thing then, and it's actually quite important now as we go through and start trying to find old machines and look at old data. So we're going to look at the Quantel Netcom card. It's a networking interface for the Quantel paint box. That also includes the edit box, the Henry, HAL, and the other variants of those like the Paintbox FX and Paintbox FAT, Paintbox Esprit, Paintbox Bravo, all those ones. And they all use the Netcom card to talk to other Quantel machines on the network. The Netcom card was born out of some other hardware that was used previously, like the Quantel bridge processor. That was another networking card, but it was like an older generation, and I've not seen many of those. I do have one, and they are quite similar to Netcom, but it was Netcom which was really adopted en masse, and that's what became the standard for Quantel to use. The Netcom board itself is the actual piece of hardware. Now the software that runs on that is Quantel's own again. It's based on Quantel's own operating system kernel, so it looks similar to a Quantel paint box when you're in the diagnostic menus. Obviously this is a networking card, so there's no video outputs or anything like that. It's literally just a CPU and some software to run to talk on the network. The software that runs on it is called Picturenet, and that was a protocol system that they created themselves for all of their Quantel machines to be able to talk and see each other and share files across the network, which in the 90s was a really, really good thing to have. You know, you could have a Quantel paint box in one room where some artists did some work, and then you could have an edit box in the edit suite actually editing stuff, and when they needed a still frame or something, a bit of artwork, they could just access that artwork on another machine and bring it to them locally, so then they could use it instead of picking up the phone and talking to the artist, say, have you got that piece of art please, and he comes trundling over with an MO disc to shove it in your machine. It dispensed with all that. Now one of the other benefits of using Picturenet was the way that they transferred images around between themselves, and that was using FTP, a nice standard. And that also meant that you could access the files from a PC and a Mac or whatever other system you might be using. And that allows us today to have an interesting avenue access vector into accessing Quantel disks, files and all that sort of stuff. Now this is not new to me. I've had Picturenet running in my little lab here for quite a long time, and I'm quite regularly transferring files from my Quantel paint box to my PC, so I can archive them, save them, do other stuff with them, and I could also import stuff as well. So I can send a TIFF file to my Quantel paint box and use it. And from that, I've been doing some recent work and looking into the Netcom and Picturenet, and I've actually started to realise it could be quite useful to have what might be called a Picturenet server here in the lab, where I can store things on the network. That is probably going to be for part 2, because I have a little project for this, which I'll probably look at in another episode. But first, we really want to see Picturenet, Netcom and all that sort of stuff, so I can actually show you the actual hardware and the software. So before we get started looking at the hardware, I just want to thank my patrons for their support. Thank you very, very much. I wouldn't be here making these videos without your help. And that is also true of PCBWay. This episode of Dexter's Tech Lab has been sponsored by PCBWay, your one-stop solution for PCB prototyping, PCB assembly, and this is not just normal PCBs. You can do flex rigid, all this sort of stuff. They also offer 3D printing, CNC machining and milling, sheet metal fabrication and injection molding. So tons and tons of options there for turning your current project into reality. So thank you very, very much for your support. Let's get the camera changed around and look at the hardware. Okay, before we get started looking at the actual Netcom board itself, let's show you where it lives in a Quantel paint box. This is my spare Quantel Paintbox Express, and it has a Netcom in it. So it's a good way to show you where they actually live inside a paint box. So let me just open this up. So here we have my Paintbox Express opened, and Netcom lives just here. It's this small half-size card which always sits above the CPU card. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to give you a little tour of this and how it actually connects into the paint box. So what I'm going to do first is just disconnect these two SCSI connectors, just so you can see the board in a little bit more detail. Let's talk about how the Netcom board talks to the paint box and talks to other machines. So we've got quite a lot of connectors on here. We've got this SCSI connector, we've got, I think this is a diagnostics port. We've got a standard Molex power connector, twisted pair Ethernet, that is 10100, obviously showing its age. This is another SCSI connector, and then we have a connector down here which plugs into the Quantel Highway. This is a completely self-contained system which runs its own operating system, has its own non-volatile memory, its own clock, everything. Now the way that it talks to the paint box is via the two SCSI channels, SCSI A and SCSI B. All Quantel V-Series machines have two SCSI channels, A and B. So that means there is a SCSI ID that the CPU card has, and there is a SCSI ID which the Netcom card has. One goes one way and one goes the other. So Netcom is listening on one SCSI port and the CPU card is listening on the other, and that's how they can talk to each other. When the paint box wants to do something with the network, it sends commands over the SCSI, which are then interpreted by Netcom, which then do tasks. Now, let's say, for example, probably one of the most common things to do was to access a file on another machine somewhere else and load it into your local paint box. What would actually happen is the CPU card would instruct the Netcom card over the SCSI to access a particular machine and load a particular file into the actual paint box hardware. So the Netcom card would then start doing all of the networking protocol stuff to be able to talk to the other machine, access the file, copy it here to the Netcom board locally, and then it would take control of the video paths on the highway. So it would then copy that image data through the highway directly into the picture stores. And once that is complete, it then hands back control back to the CPU card, and you carry on using your Quantel paint box. It's all done very, very transparently. One of the advantages to this of having the CPU card completely separate from the networking is it allows the networking to be accessed by other machines without any impact on the performance of the actual main paint box. So people can be hammering files on and off this Netcom and its own dedicated disk, and it won't affect the user's operation while they're doing painting operations, for example. It means that it's completely autonomous. And indeed, this also means that these Netcom boards weren't just used in Quantel paint boxes. They could actually be used standalone. So there were various applications where you could actually have this Netcom board installed in a very, very small little rack unit to perform other tasks because it was designed to be very flexible. And that is why we have the Molex connector there, so we can input power into it without it being plugged into the highway. And we have the two SCSI channels to be able to talk to SCSI channel A, which is where the communication between the CPU card and the Netcom takes place. The CPU has its boot disk on SCSI A. The Netcom has its boot disk on SCSI B. So two separate disks. I can actually show you that. Just zoom out, you can see we have two disks down in the bottom. So one of them is the boot disk for the main paint box, and the other one is the boot disk for Netcom. So they are entirely separate systems. Right, I think we've done looking at that. Let's pack this away and I will show you Netcom in a little bit more detail. So this is the Netcom board that I've been using for my learning how all this stuff works. The small variant of the Netcom board is called Snetcom because it's just called the small Netcom. The other Netcom board, the regular size one, is the one that's used in the 6 and 8U crates. So that is things like the Quantel HAL Express, Edit Box, and the Henry. Those have a regular full-size card which plugs into one of the slots there. It's exactly the same as this, it's just on a larger board. So let's have a quick tour. So we have the connector which plugged onto the paint box highway. So this has all the video bus connections, and as you can see here, I've got a connector so I can access the diagnostics serial port just with some jumpers plugged in on the pins. There's the CPU, and we have some Altera Max CPLDs doing all the core logic that's going to be talking with the Quantel stuff. We have 16 megabytes of RAM. We have a security PAL, just like the paint box. This also can contain option codes to say what type of Netcom it actually is. So you can have one which is designed to be inside a machine. You can have one which is designed to be external to a machine on its own, and that's all defined in the security PAL. The serial number of the security PAL should match the actual one in the paint box. They normally just put an N on the end of it to denote that it's a Netcom security PAL. But in reality, the serial numbers don't need to match. It's not really an issue. Next to that, we have the non-volatile RAM, and any other things of note. We've got two SCSI controllers because, as I said, we have SCSI A and SCSI B. Ethernet networking stuff is all over here using SMC chipsets. We've got external power via the Molex, twisted pair networking port. On this side, we've got a couple of ports. These are just diagnostics. So these, I've never plugged anything into them. Never really looked at them, but yeah, I'm sure they're just diagnostics into the actual CPU. There's a status LED indicator on the front and 4 rotary switches to set various options, mostly related to which boot file off the disk it will load and what the SCSI settings are. So you can change which channel the SCSI listener and things like that is on, and you can also control termination. This is an MC68349 CPU, and it's got some additional functions built in. I believe it has DMA. That's one thing that's built into this. I think there's some other things as well. It's meant to be more of an embedded CPU, so it has various functions extra to what you get on the actual CPU. But it's quite a speedy little processor, that. As I say, I think it's about equivalent of a 68030 at about, well, this is actually running at 25 megahertz, so, but I'm not sure how much cache it has. I think the cache is slightly different. So I think that pretty much covers the actual hardware itself. As I said, there's no painting functions in this, so it's really just a CPU, SCSI ports, and a port to talk to the paint box. video paths and the networking interface. Now, as you can probably see, this is my little setup to have Netcom running. Now this has been configured so the Netcom is completely self-contained. It doesn't need any paintbox hardware. It will just boot up off this Zulu SCSI disk emulator. We also have an MO drive there as well, and that means I can just power this on and it just appears on the Quantel network, and we're all good to go. Now this is where it kind of gets a bit interesting, because when I was playing around with this, I started to realise that I could actually use this as a very big Quantel network drive. If this was mounted in a small enclosure and I gave it lots of storage, because I've done some recent investigations into how large you can actually make Quantel disks, and well, I've tested them up to 32 gigabytes. So given that we can use the Zulu SCSI to have multiple drives on it, that opens up some possibilities about having a Netcom server that can deliver and store things like pictures, cutouts, fonts, copies of the software, and all this sort of stuff in a very, very compact little box that could also be potentially unplugged and taken to other places and used to archive other machines and help people out. It seems to me that that's the way this is going to go, and that's going to be the plan for the project, which is to take what we have here and mount it in a case, so it can be basically my entire Quantel repository of files. I think that I can probably get enough storage on here to do that. I mean, there's a 64 gigabyte card in there at the moment. I'm going to increase that to 128 gig and partition it up, so there should be 3 disks on there of 32 gigabytes each. The amount of storage that that gives you for Quantel files is just insane, so that should be the way that's going to go. Right, anyway, sorry, I've gone off at a tangent. What I want to do is power this on. I'll turn on my Paintbox Express and you can see what happens when we actually use Picturenet. So as you can see, I have my Quantel Paintbox up. Now, as I said, this has Picturenet built into it, but at the moment the other Netcom isn't on. So this is the only Picturenet device on the network. So if I go to the library, I have only system and shared disks because they're local to this machine. If I go to network, we can see this paint box and nothing else. So Netcom will start loading the software off the disks that I've got configured on the Zulu SCSI. And there we can see the Picturenet has now appeared. If I go into area 1, we've got net disk, and that is the actual Netcom that you're seeing on the camera. So we can see all the boot up stuff there. It's kind of similar to what you see when you're booting up a paint box, but obviously more of it's network related. Now in here we have all the functions to set up the Picturenet network. You know, devices can be named, they can be part of areas. So area 1 can have up to, I think it's 99 machines in it, and then you could have an area 2, and so you could actually segment the network into, let's say it was paintbox artists in area 1, and you could have edit in area 2, and it just allows you to organise your machines a little bit easier. So all the networking stuff is in here, TCP, IP. So really all you need to do to make these work is give it an IP address on your network. That's pretty much it. There's very, very little to configure to get these to work, which is great. So I'm just going to turn off the diagnostics console now, because we don't really need to see that, and there's not a huge amount in here to see. Let's just have a think before I switch off. Filer. So what I've actually got configured on this Zulu SCSI is 3 SCSI disks. One of them is 32 gigabytes, one is 16 gigabytes, and the other I think is 2 gigabytes, which is my repository for all Quantel software. So I have copies of all the archive versions of Paintbox, Paintbox Options, Paintbox FX, Editbox, Henry, HAL, all those different versions of software. I've got them archived on that disk. So that is pretty much it. So let's get rid of the window, and we can look properly at the network. So now Picturenet is up. I have on my full page menu, I have net shared as options to be able to read and write to. So if I want to access the files on this network drive, I select read and write, or I could just do read if I wanted to, and this will access the disk on Netcom. So if I now go over to my library, do find, net shared is on, hit end, and it will load and show me all of the files which are on this disk, of which there is quite a lot. I think there's about 2,500 images on this currently, and it's going up all the time. So there is lots and lots and lots of stuff that I've found on various machines which I've been copying to this drive. And as you can see, these files, I can just access them just like they're local to my machine. So at the point where I click this and load it into my Paintbox, my Paintbox CPU is telling my Netcom to talk to the Netcom over there to copy the disk from copy the file off the disk to the Netcom over the network to my Netcom, and then my Netcom then loads it into memory, just like that. And you can see how quick and easy it is. It's almost completely transparent in terms of how fast it is to load images up and save them on the network. It was a brilliant system. Now, in addition to that, you can actually also access any of the files which you deal with when you're working on a Paintbox. So if I wanted fonts, I've got loads of fonts on this shared drive as well. So I can this can also be my font repository. So it's very, very flexible, and I think, as I said, having this put into a box where I can just have a massive storage area where I can store Quantel disks, I think is great. And it also shows off how flexible this would have been in a production environment. You could have Paintbox artists, HAL machines, edit boxes all networked together, where you can swap and change and move files around. So if I wanted to switch to one of my other disks, I don't think there's any files on here actually. Find. Oh, I've got my welcome pictures, because this is where I store all my software. So these are all the default welcome images. Now, as I said before, the network disks on Quantel are all FTP, which means I can access them from my PC. So I've got a little window here that I can just access, and this is now automatically logged in by FTP to the network disk. So I can now do dir, and you can see the drives net shared and the software disks and the beginning of all the images, and I can list out every single image on the disk, but it does take quite a while. And if I want to access one of these pictures, it's literally just a case of just typing regular FTP commands. There are some quirks to it, but if I wanted to get test card 625, I just do get 0.50.1, and it's going to be called test.tiff. And what that will do, it will FTP the Quantel file to me, and at the same time it will convert it into a TIFF file. So it's just seamless to be able to then load it into Photoshop or whatever. And likewise, I can have a TIFF file on my PC, and I could just FTP it to the Netcom board, and it'll just convert it to Quantel's own internal format. So I mentioned before about remounting all of this Netcom stuff into another box, and that is what is going to be in part 2, because we're going to look at mounting it into this old I think this is a mini ITX PC case. I'll just give you a quick look at this. So this, interestingly, used to be my old web server and database server and all that. So this used to be connected up to the internet back in the days when it was safe to do things like that. Not really a thing to do nowadays. So this was a small Windows 2003 server system that I built, as I said, quite a long time ago now. It's been powered off for many, many years. I seem to remember it. There's an Intel Atom CPU on a little mini ITX board. There's I think it was a 20 gigabyte laptop, 2.5-inch drive, and a CD drive, and that was pretty much it. So my idea is to rip out all this stuff that I don't use anymore and take the Netcom board and install it into here. I've already got a ready power supply. There's a bay there for the MO drive to go in. There's a bay here for the Zulu SCSI to mount. It'll just be a case of trying to work out how to actually mount this down onto the board, because obviously it's not based on a standard PC form factor. There's going to be a bit of fiddling around to try and get things mounted onto the actual base, but I think it should be doable. And it means this box will become my network disk, and I don't have to power on my Quantel Paint box if I want to access some of the files, because they won't be. They'll all be on my network drive. So it's much easier and faster to power this up and access the files on it. It also uses a lot less power. You know, I've measured this with the MO drive at I think 36 watts. So I don't think I would have it on all of the time, but it can be on for extended periods. Unlike the Paintbox Express, which idles away burning 250 watts, whatever you're doing with it. So in part 2, I'm going to remove all the bits out of this, and we'll start trying to figure out how we can fit all this into this box. I hope you enjoyed this one. I hope it was a bit of an education into some of the Quantel networking, and hopefully you'll join me on part 2 where we play around making this into big shared network drive. Thanks very much for watching, everyone. I'll see you on the next video. Bye for now.